Hey guys, today we are talking bread, but not the soft, fluffy, sourdough you learned during lockdown kind. No, we are talking medieval bread. Dense, dark, and dangerous. The kind that could chip a tooth, feed a village, or maybe give you mild hallucinations, depending on the harvest. This is the real carb loading of history. Scratch made with sweat, luck, and whatever tools you did not already break grinding last week, barley. So grab your wooden bowl and your patience. We are going in. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It all begins with the grain. Wheat if you are lucky, rye or barley if you are not. And before you even dream of flour, you have to grind it. This is not a quick buzz in a Nutribullet. This is back-breaking labor, bent over a rotary quern, two heavy stones stacked like millstone pancakes, one rotated slowly by hand, grinding grain between their teeth. It is dusty, it is exhausting, and it takes forever. Women and children often handle this work, kneeling beside the quern for hours, muscles aching, sifting out the coarser bits with hand-woven sieves. In better-off villages or monastic estates, watermills and windmills ease the strain. These marvels of medieval engineering use gears, pulleys, and natural forces to do the work faster, if not cleaner. Rats still love the grain piles. Watermills clog with mud. Blades splinter in storms. But compared to the rotary quern, it is like jumping from dial-up to broadband. And flour was not pure, depending on who milled it and how recently they cleaned their stones. You could end up with pebbles, straw, bits of wood, and the occasional, extra protein. Some regions even intentionally left grit in, believing the texture showed off the baker's rustic pride. Others were just bad at sifting. Mainstream historical fact, grinding grain was so essential and time-consuming that millers held a powerful position in many communities. Some even charged a portion of the flour as a toll, which made them rich, resented, or both. But here's your fringe tidbit. Archaeological digs in parts of northern Europe have uncovered worn-down skeletons, specifically women's, that show excessive knee and shoulder stress, likely from years of daily grinding. Bread left physical marks before it ever hit your teeth. Historians still argue whether these domestic grind stations were a choice or a necessity. Did local customs empower women with control over food? Or were they simply stuck with the dirtiest, dullest part of survival while the men chased pigs? But one thing is clear. Before a single loaf puffed in the oven, someone was sweating over stone. The rhythmic scraping of grain into flour echoed through villages, manors, and monasteries alike. It was a sound of labor, a sound of hunger, and a promise that maybe, if the windmill did not break and the rats did not beat you to it, you would have something worth baking tomorrow. Once the flour's ready, and by ready, we mean ground, sifted, and maybe 30% less gravel than usual, it is time to turn dust into dough. But this is not a matter of cracking eggs and measuring yeast with a kitchen scale. This is medieval bread making, and nothing is ever that simple. First, water, cold, murky, may be fetched from a stream with a helpful frog floating nearby. Then salt, if you have it, and maybe a handful of last week sourdough starter, if it has not died in the corner of your pantry ditch. Commercial yeast 1T exists for centuries. If your dough rises, it is a small miracle born from wild yeast clinging to the air. Your hands, or the leftover crumbs in the mixing trough, you knead. With your whole body, your hands punch the mass, your forearms ache. In colder months, you pray the dough stays warm enough to ferment. In warmer ones, you hope it does not ferment too fast. Some bakers tuck dough under blankets, others beside the hearth, a few even bury bowls in manure piles, using the steady warmth to nudge things along. Welcome to the spa treatment bread never asked for. Now comes the shaping. If it is a fancy day, a feast or festival, You might sculpt a braided loaf or stamp a noble seal into the duff with a carved wooden press, but most of the time, it is simple. A round, squat wheel of dense duff, slashed on top to control the rise and to let the evil spirits out. Yes, really. That superstition stuck around longer than some kingdoms. Many medieval bakers marked their loaves with a unique pattern or symbol, not just for style, but for traceability. If a loaf turned out badly, too small, too hard, or heaven forbid made someone sick, the baker could be fined, flogged, or forced to publicly eat their own failure, literally. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, bakers baked to test loaves, tiny trial versions of their bread, to check the rise and avoid wasting duff. These were sometimes sold cheaply to children, or used to appease grumpy priests. Historians still argue whether the communal oven system helped improve baking consistency, or just centralized the risk of burning the village down. In many places, individuals could not bake at home. Too dangerous, so you would prep your duff, carry it on a flat wooden peel, and queue outside the communal oven with your neighbors. Bakers ran the ovens, fueled them with scarce wood, and timed the bakes. You would mark your dough, hand it off, and hope to get back a loaf that was yours and edible. The heat was intense. Ovens were fired with bundles of kindling until scorching, then swept out and loaded with dough. A good oven might hold dozens of loaves. A bad one might burn them all. And once they were in, you waited. You swapped gossip. You sniffed the air for burning. You prayed. Because baking bread was not just a domestic chore. It was a social performance, a balancing act between chemistry, weather, and faith. And you had not even tasted it yet. The loaves emerge, steaming and cracked, from the community oven. And if you are lucky, they are still yours. The baker hands you a lump the size of a badger, and roughly the weight of one, too. It is dark, sometimes near black if rye flour's involved, and the crust is as hard as a knight's conscience. But it is warm, and it is bread, and for now, that is enough. You carry it home wrapped in cloth, feeling the radiant heat seep through. But this is not your daily sandwich bread. This is survival bread, dense, earthy, and designed to last. It needs to. You bake again for a week, maybe two, so every slice matters. You store the loaf in a wooden box or linen sack, hanging it from a beam to keep it safe from rats and damp. By day 2, it is firmer. By day 5, it could stop an arrow. Still edible, yes, but now it gets dunked in broth, soaked in ale, or grated into porridge. The line between food and building material is thinner than you would expect. Medieval bread varied wildly depending on your social class. The nobility dined on fine white loaves called manchet, made from sifted wheat flour and baked soft. Peasants, on the other hand, ate maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, sometimes barley, sometimes whatever grains had not molded in the corner bin. The result, a heavy, sour slab that filled the belly but did little to charm the senses. And then there is the dark side, literally. In lean years, when grain was scarce or poorly stored, people resorted to acorns, peas, even ground up tree bark to stretch their flour. The worst offender, though, was ergot, a poisonous fungus that could infect rye and create hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Entire villages suffered outbreaks of Anthony's fire, a burning sickness blamed on everything from demons to divine punishment, but actually caused by tainted bread. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some folk believed in bread charms, loaves baked with herbs, ashes, or even nails, believed to ward off illness or bad harvests. One tale speaks of a baker burying a loaf at a crossroads to stop a plague. Others smeared the first slice with lard and threw it into the fire as an offering to kitchen spirits. Historians still argue whether medieval communities understood the science behind spoilage and foodborne illness, or simply responded through ritual, repetition, and blind hope. Did they suspect mold was the culprit, or did they just blame the baker as bad mood? Either way, they adapted, Bad bread became beer, rock-hard crusts were softened in stews, and no crumb was wasted. At the manor, the steward inspects each delivery from the oven. At the cottage, the mother carves slices with a short knife, handing the warmest bit to the child who fetched the firewood. Bread is currency. Bread is comfort. Bread is power, hunger, and prayer all rolled into one compact, blistered package. And as dusk settles over the village, you can still smell it. Smoke, grain, and the faint tang of yeast hanging like incense in the rafters. By the seventh day, the loaf has transformed. No longer warm, no longer soft. It sits like a quiet relic of last week's labor, hard, cracked, and faintly sore. But in the medieval world, bread does not retire, it reincarnates. In wealthier homes, stale bread is trimmed, grated, or sliced and then soaked in milk or ale to form the base of pottages and stews. Trenchers, flat slabs of coarse bread, serve as plates, absorbing gravy and grace until they are soft enough to eat or fed to the dogs. In humbler kitchens, the crusts go into cauldrons, softening over the fire alongside roots, beans, and scraps of meat. This is not culinary waste. It is just stage 2 of the bread life cycle. A child helps crush stale crust into crumbs with a mortar and pestle. These are mixed into blood puddings or sausages, binding what little meat is available. A monk dips hard rinds into his broth with reverent patience. A traveler chews on a piece of week-old rye as if it is a challenge from God. Bread was not just food, it was infrastructure. Monasteries recorded exact amounts of flour used daily. Bakers were licensed and inspected. Markets enforced rules on bread weight and quality to prevent fraud. In England, the assize of bread regulated price, size, and ingredients to protect buyers. A baker caught cheating risked fines, or being nailed by the ear to the door of his shop. But even regulations could not stop famine. In times of crop failure or war, grains became scarce, and bread darkened into desperation. Dried beans, lentils, or even chalk were ground into the dough. The result, bread that filled the stomach, but offered little nourishment. In some places, these famine loaves were black, gritty, and bitter, better than starving, but just barely. Fringe detail. Some households marked loaves with personal symbols before baking, crosses, stars, or initials, to retrieve them from communal ovens. Others scored them with sacred signs, believing that bread thus blessed would never mold. One legend claims a baker who forgot to mark his dough had his entire batch turned to ash as divine punishment. Historians still argue whether the symbolic scoring was more about faith or function. Was it a genuine belief in protection, a practical method of id, or just tradition? Like much of medieval life, the answer lies in the gray area where ritual meets survival. Even the nobility, with their white manchets and sweet brioches, were not immune to bread's slow decay. A forgotten loaf could signal carelessness, a maggot in a trencher, embarrassment. Bakers in noble service could be dismissed for repeat offenses. The kitchen was a place of pride, and bread, its ever-watchful sentinel. As twilight deepens, a woman kneels by the hearth, breaking a stale piece of bread into a simmering onion broth. Her child watches, chin on knees, waiting for the softening to begin. This meal has no ceremony, no feast, just quiet warmth and a hard-earned spoonful of comfort. Because even when it is old, bread still feeds. It teaches patience, reinvents itself, holds the memory of fire and flour. By now, we have walked the flour-dusted trail from field to loaf to crust. But if you want to truly understand medieval bread, step into the shadows, into the strange and sometimes unsettling ways people tried to improve, stretch, or even deceive with it. We begin with additives, not all of them savory. In hard times, or among dishonest bakers, bread became a chemistry experiment. Hazel bark, ground peas, even powdered bones found their way into dough to bulk it up. Sometimes this was desperation, sometimes greed. The line between innovation and adulteration was thin, and often crossed. In urban centers, where guilds kept a tighter grip, bakers faced inspections. Loaves were broken in public, weighed, sniffed, even tasted by officials. Too light, too full, or too spongy. You might be fined, pilloried, or worse, accused of cheating the stomachs of the poor. But outside the cities, things were looser. A village loaf might hide anything, from boiled hay to lichen scraped from stones. There were documented cases of bakers being punished for stretching duff with chalk, clay, or even ash. These were not fringe tales. They were part of the public record. In 14th century France, one baker was fined for using dust from the mill floor in his flour. He insisted it added texture. The magistrate disagreed. But the weirdness was not all wicked. Bread was believed to have spiritual properties, especially when tied to ritual. Holy loaves, blessed by priests, were thought to heal sickness, protect travelers, even calm storms if tossed into the sea. Some monasteries kept miracle crumbs from ancient loaves, handed down in tiny reliquaries, and the superstitions did not end there. A loaf that split in the oven, bad omen. A crust shaped like a skull, time to pray. In some regions, the first slice of a new loaf was offered to the household ghost, left on the hearth overnight, just in case. One fringe tidbit: a few 15th century cookbooks describe a party trick loaf baked around live birds or frogs, cut open at the feast to surprise the guests. It is culinary theater with a touch of chaos, possibly a prank, possibly a warning never to trust a particularly smug baker. Historians still argue whether these oddities were widespread or isolated eccentricities. Were enchanted loaves part of village routine, or just tall tales baked into folklore? It is hard to say, but medieval bread was more than food. It was meaning, memory, and mystery wrapped in crust. Even how you broke bread mattered. Sharing a loaf was a sign of alliance. Denying someone a piece, deep insult. And the act of breaking, not slicing, was seen as more humble, more communal. Knives had their place, but not always at the table. Back in the manor kitchen, a servant lifts the final loaf of the day. A small, dense bun cooled on the sill. It won't be eaten tonight. Instead, it is tucked into a cloth pouch, tied with a twine, and carried up to the sleeping chamber. There, a sick child waits. Not for dinner, but for comfort. Bread, warmed in hands and rubbed with honey, will be pressed to his chest as balm. And outside, in a nearby field, tomorrow sweet shivers in the breeze. Still green, still wild, but destined, eventually, to be milled, mixed, kneaded, and fed to another hungry soul. Because medieval bread is not just hard, it is haunted, honored, and human. The coals in the oven fade to amber. The air is thick with flour dust and memory. Somewhere, a crust cracks as it cools. The world slows. Bread has been made, again, and in its making, a moment of certainty has been won. Tomorrow may bring rain, pests, or hunger. But for now, there is warmth, and the faint scent of rye, and the soft sigh of dough that rose against the odds. In this quiet pause, history lingers. Dense, dark, and a little dangerous. Thanks for walking this path with me. Until next time, eat slow and chew carefully.